Thanks to all of you. Such a huge pleasure and honor to talk about these things and nuances that we all love so much. So anyway, how are you?
Good.
Good.
Good to see you. Thanks for having us. Good to see you,
My
Chris and
pleasure.
Scott.
Likewise. Well, thanks for having me.
It's quite mind-blowing seeing you together and talking about these subjects. So anyway, without further ado, the peak week. Speaking for bodybuilding, such a nuanced topic, I think it's full of mythologies, full of beliefs and all things that you can find here in Mexico, for instance, to give a brief introduction. It's more of a mythology. Like people expect to fix all sorts of things during a single week instead of the all the weeks prior in the preparation. So that's where I wanted to start off this conversation with you all. What is actually the purpose? What can we actually expect from a peak week from these protocols? Because as you state in your paper, it's really not a miracle. It's really not like we were gonna fix all the things we didn't do in the weeks prior, right?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one thing that we wanted to make sure that we wanted to highlight in our paper is, peak week is definitely important. We don't want to minimize that, but it's not going to fix the issues or things that you didn't address in the period 16, 20, 24 weeks. In fact, I think that's usually where a lot of the myths come along, where you maybe get a judge that tells you, hey, you're holding water, but really the judge more often than not really means you're actually not conditioned enough. You need to lose more body fat. And, to be nice, they might tell you you need to lose more water, but realistically, you really need to lose an extra 5, 10 pounds of body fat to really be stage ready and really be competitive. And that takes place in the other 15 or 20 weeks. And I think preparing for a long period of time, long enough, allowing a long enough prep period is really what's important. But the peak week is important for what we say in fine tuning the physique, and you can really make some differences in that.
Because
I
I
like this.
was I was listening. I'm sorry to interrupt, Dr. Stevenson. I was actually listening to a conversation between you, Guillermo, and Dr. Stevenson. That many people don't really need a peak week. They can actually just look on point without doing all these protocols. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, Dr. Stevenson, please?
Sure. That's the super important point that a lot of people, it's funny, a lot of people even jump to that, which is very, very true without having read the paper where we explicitly note that that's actually the case too. Because it's very, very true. The thing that happens so often is people try to, like you said, use the peak week to produce a miracle and end up shooting for, something extraordinary when in fact they could have just walked in the show and looked better. The thing that I was going to say that I sometimes tell people when they're trying to be nice, like you're holding a little bit of fat, which is sort of says the same thing. And people say, oh, I think I know what you mean. Like you need about 4 more weeks to diet down. The other interesting thing about water and fat in terms of like that's really one of the main things that you really want to do. Fullness obviously is important. That's kind of the two twin goals is to be both dry and full same time. But when you're lean enough, and this is something that we talked about last time the three of us were together at dinner, is trying to actually document this phenomenon, which I know I've seen many, many times, is that the leaner you are, the more likely you are to be dry and the quicker the water comes off if you do manipulate your sodium and your water in order to have that effect. So once you get lean enough, you may end up simply being so dry that you don't have to do anything to try to get drier. In fact, you can end up being flat if you push things too hard, which is a mistake that's very often made when people are, in the vernacular I like to use, shooting for an A plus. They're trying to find something that they've never even seen, and a way to sort of grade if you're doing that is in that last week or so before a show, or the 2 weeks. Let's say you've gotten in shape. You'll have those times when you get in the gym, you get pumped up, and maybe you have a good mirror, the lighting's perfect, and you're like, it's like kind of a holy shit moment. I look amazing. This is the best I've ever looked in my own mind, or you look extraordinary. You're not always like that. At the end of the day, you might hold more water. In the morning, you might be drier, but looks a little bit flat, more flat. So that's kind of like the best you'd really want to shoot for in reality's sake. Every once in a while, you'll hit something when you do a peak week, and it's like, okay, I've really gotten everything I possibly can. But if you think of, I want to look at least that good and maybe a smidge better, as opposed to, I'm going to create a whole new physique appearance with this peak week, some sort of magical thing. and you're trying to create something you've never once seen before that doesn't even resemble how you previously looked, then people are probably they're shooting for the stars, and you know, they'd be lucky if they hit the moon a lot of times, because you end up doing too much. So it's very important to do in that respect, and I'll let Chris chime in on this. What we talked about in the paper too is to do a practice run where you figure out where and when you look the best. Ideally, everything would be timed so you look the best on the day of the show during your practice run, and then you can, of course, base things for the actual peak week, if you decide to do one, on what happened during that peak week. And one option could be that practice run basically does nothing for you. You end up manipulating a bunch of things, your weight goes up and down, and you end up basically where you could have been if you just dropped your water, you know, a little earlier in the day before and cut your carbs out early. So, or you may look better before you even start carb loading because you got so much drier. So you can learn a lot from that peak week and realize, you know what, I don't have to do a full-blown set of manipulations as we sort of describe in the paper as kind of an idealized example. I can just do some part of that in some way, shape, or form, and that's all that I need to do really to optimize where I am in terms of how much muscle I have, how full I can get, how dry I can be. So there's a million and one ways to skin the cat, and you don't have to use all of them at once necessarily.
Right.
Yeah.
So Chris, can you come in a little bit on what Dr. Stevenson was mentioning, that some people end up actually looking worse with all these protocols, that they, after the competition, they have a burger, they have more water, they have more sodium in general, and they look insane, and they go, oh, I think I look better now than I did in the competition. Can you come in on why that happened, please?
Yeah, well, you know, something I wanted to mention is if you are someone who is in great shape and you look pretty darn good in the gym towards that tail on the contest prep, you should look great on stage as long as you're not messing with too many variables that you haven't messed with before and you don't know how you're going to respond to. So one thing I will say is I feel like a lot of competitors actually step on stage a bit flat, and a lot of times that's due to them fearing carbohydrates to a certain extent, and or manipulating water, cutting water way too soon. So just as a quick example, if you're 2 weeks out and you've been dieting for 12, 14, or 16 weeks at that time, you should be relatively flat. You should be on the flatter end of the spectrum in regards to how much muscle glycogen you actually can hold if you weren't in a calorie deficit and you weren't in this fat loss contest prep phase. So if you look darn good in the gym and you are still flat compared to how full you actually can be, just taking 2 to 3 refeed days and high carbohydrate days should give you a much better idea of what your physique would look like filled out. And if you're still getting like decent pumps in the gym towards the tail on the contest prep, I mean, you should look fantastic with more carbohydrates and more glycogen. So yeah, I just see a lot of people doing too many things incorrectly towards the end. And then going back to what you mentioned, once they do start rehydrating or they do have some sodium and they kind of have that cheat meal after the show, they look way better because they finally have more water inside the cell where they wanted it, and they have more fuel or more carbohydrate being stored within the muscle, so it's giving them that fuller look. So yeah, again, I just see a lot of people fear the total amount of carbohydrates they actually need to maximize fullness, and then too many people are doing very strange things with their water intake that week of.
Very well. So to begin with the variables that we can actually manipulate I'm actually following the paper, the order of the paper. Can we begin by talking a little bit, Dr. Guillermo, about carbohydrates, the protocols of depletion, front loading, back loading, the differences, the actual evidence we have? Because I think there's just one study, the Morris et al., that actually did the protocol and tested that protocol.
Yeah, this is actually fairly interesting. One of the things that when we were looking at the literature, we actually see that this is actually the most prominently used technique. So actually most bodybuilders, when we actually that have been surveyed, you actually see that this is indeed, most people actually do carb depletion, carb loading in some sense of the word. So it's very often employed. So there have been some protocols that have been studied. We actually did cite 3 studies in there, but there was one that actually did it more specifically with bodybuilders. We did actually have a case study as well. Dr. Schoenfeld and I worked on a case study last year with a natural physique competitor. That was actually cited in there, where we actually see he did a carb depletion for 3 days, then he did carb loading. He took carbs, roughly about 400 or 500 grams of carbs a day for a couple of days, and then we did ultrasound measurements in the upper extremity and the lower extremity, and we actually saw that there was actually an increase in muscle size there from primarily the glycogen and the carbohydrate loading component. But the Demorais study was actually fairly interesting. It was done with bodybuilders, where they went through and they actually looked at they blinded the judges, and they actually looked at their abilities to did the athletes actually look better, the ones that actually did the carb loading, and they actually found some positive results. One of the things that they did find as well was that a lot of them reported some gastrointestinal discomfort, which is something that you want to potentially consider. So the protocol that we use, we talked briefly about backloading or front loading, or kind of what we do is we do utilize both in a sense. So backloading would be where you do all the carb loading literally at the end of the week. So if you're going to compete on Saturday, you would mainly just carb load on, say, Thursday, Friday, compete Saturday. Front loading would be you carb early on in the week, let's say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then you kind of hold on through the rest of the week. And then the protocol that we've used a lot, that we actually like, is kind of a hybrid of those, where we actually carb deplete for the first couple of days, and then we actually carb load in the middle of the week, typically a Wednesday, Thursday, and then on Friday just kind of hang on. Hopefully you've done your job in repleting and the super compensation effect of those extra carbohydrates, and then now you're just basically not overly exercising, not overly posing, not doing a ton of activity to deplete the glycogen. You're basically just keeping the tank full per se, and at this point in time, you're now trying to just promote the diuresis at that point in time to increase the likelihood of looking full and not losing that full and dry effect that we're looking at.
Right, because I think only besides the case study that you did, the Morais, it's the only one that gives us practical applications, right? Like, let's say 10 grams per kilogram. But if we front load, maybe we don't know how much carbs we need. Is this right? It's more of a gambling.
Well, even within our recommendations, you see that we actually have a very big prescription, because there's so much inter-individual variability. And we actually cite a couple of studies, it's like how many carbs does a person need to actually kind of get that full effect. And it's very different. So some people may need only 4 grams per kilogram of body weight. Some people may need up to 12. Obviously the absolute value is going to be different. So we like to use the relative value, because it's going to be different from, a 220-pound guy is going to be different than a 150-pound guy. But that's why the relative terms are actually really important. But even then, there's some inter-individual variability. You guys pointed to something that actually Chris did, that some people are really afraid of the carb loading. I was one of those people early on in my career. I would carb load on 300, 350 grams. And when I actually looked my best and made leaps and bounds significantly better, I actually loaded on triple that amount, so closer to 900 to 1,000 grams for a couple of days. And when my coach at that time told me to do that, I thought it was insane. I was so afraid, but I listened, and the difference was amazing in what I actually look like. So personally, I know I need several days to carb load. One day is not enough, and each individual is going to be a little bit different. And I need higher quantities. I can't do 4 grams per kilo per body weight for me does nothing for me.
But then the next challenge, Dr. Stevenson, if you can talk about this, the gastrointestinal symptoms, because 1,000 grams of carbohydrates, well, you can say that easily, but to actually do it and to actually feel comfortable about it, not being bloated, not being uncomfortable in your training and in the days prior, how can we best begin to do this practice?
1,000 grams isn't that much, actually. I've done 2,000 grams or more before. So And I've actually worked with people that needed like 4 or 5 days.
Right.
That is a lot, don't get me wrong, but some people need, there's so much variability there. So the first thing that I think we suggest in the paper, some of this blends together in my mind because I've talked about this topic and thought about it for so long, is that if, and I know Chris and I have talked about this before for sure, is that the person should use the carbohydrates that they've been using in their prep so far. So, you know, preferentially someone, if they're using a low carb approach, is at least having some kind of an intermittent carb up. There's some sort of carb cycling that's involved. And they're using carbohydrates that they plan to use during their carb up to some degree. So things that your system is already used to, you know, bodybuilders for good reason because they want to be very specific and track things are notorious for being kind of mono eaters and eating, you know, the 5 foods that work is something, you know, some of your listeners may have heard of. It's one of my kind of favorites that's out there. And you can diet down with just eating those foods. Not a long-term sustainable thing, but picking foods that you know work for you is important. And there's some really interesting data just looking at the glycemic responses, comparing things like white bread versus maltodextrin. And if you compare the individual responses, you'll see different areas on the curve for one person versus the other being higher or lower, depending on the food source. You'll see different patterns. Not all curves are sort of perfect bell curves or inverted U's. Sometimes you get various sort of almost roller coaster looking glycemic response curves from individuals for some reason. I have found, you know, people who follow me know that I like to use sorbet. It works phenomenally for me. For whatever reason, you know, there's right. Probably the gut microbiome, relative activity of enzymes. Some of it may be also that it's an insulinogenic effect. There's a cephalic insulin release that can come when you're eating something that tastes really good to you. So insulin, of course, is going to help facilitate the glycogen loading that you experience. So choosing the right form of food is a smart one, and that's variable too. A lot of this is sort of anecdotal. I have a friend who used to do, and this isn't a midweek carb up or a preloading, but he's done this for years, and he's the most extreme example I can imagine because he would literally diet for weeks or months, nothing but chicken and rice. Literally, it had to be chicken and rice, as plain and strict as you can get. And then he started doing actually this kind of a peak week years ago when I helped show him how to do it. And he would shitload with a Pizza Hut pizza that he would start eating like in the middle of the night, early hours of the morning, a whole deep dish, large pizza. And it didn't upset his stomach, which is just amazing because he was eating nothing remotely close to that during the entire months before that. So those are some of the most important things. The tricks that I tend to employ with people are using digestive enzymes. There are some data that will suggest that those can be helpful. Keeping your microbiome just in shape too. Someone who's doing a good job of trying to consume some probiotic foods, maybe even using a probiotic if they want in pill form. That's not a bad idea as well. But the main thing is going to be choosing those foods. So the other issue that people can run into is trying to get in enough carbohydrate. This goes back to having used what you've been using, but we know that things like glucose, as opposed to a high molecular weight carbohydrate source like a highly branched cyclic dextrin, the latter would be a better option just for gastric emptying purposes. The faster you can get the glucose out of the gut, that's the limiter, the faster it's going to be absorbed in the small intestine. So those sorts of things can be employed. Glucose disposal agents are some things that, I haven't seen that really documented in terms of the GI, but those can have effects. I mean, heck, alpha lipoic acid has been prescribed, at least in Germany, as a treatment, as a sort of supplementary treatment for people with diabetes to reduce blood sugar. So there's possible enhancements there that people could employ, but it comes back to the practice run. Figure out which foods work for you. And try to avoid the thing that, just from another practical standpoint, and this especially applies to someone who wants to do a quote shitload the morning before a show. Try to avoid that temptation. Okay, now it's a free-for-all. All I'm going to do is eat all the carbs that I've been wanting to eat, that I've been smelling when I drive past IHOP or name the restaurant or what have you, and you go overboard and try to eat things that really aren't going to do well for you. Because you're still trying to stay on target. There's a rhyme and reason to the carb up. it sure is fun to post the pictures of all those things that you're eating, you know, but they should be things that you know will work well for you. That's sort of my best answer to that. But it's such an individual thing. You have to see what works for the person and employ the strategies piecemealed together in a way that fits the individual's circumstances, their symptoms, and you know how hardy their GI system is.
And also one important point you mentioned in the paper is the fiber intake. To be wary of the fiber intake because we can increase bloating, water retention, and to actually reduce fiber intake. Dr. Chris, could you elaborate a little bit on fiber intake, please?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So that again is going to be a little bit different from each individual as well. I keep a little bit of fiber in when I'm carb loading, just to ensure that I still kind of have a bowel movement that following day. But it's going to be significantly lower compared to an average day. So just as a quick example, let's just say my fiber got up to 40 to 45 grams per day because I was consuming a lot of veggies towards the tail end of the diet. During a carbohydrate loading period, I would probably get no more than 15 grams of fiber in from some vegetable sources. Again, maybe utilizing something like asparagus or something like that. A vegetable that I'm used to, that I've had throughout contest prep, and maybe something that provides some sort of diuretic effect as well. But you definitely don't want to experiment with foods you're not familiar with. So as Dr. Scott was saying, I actually have done that in the past, where my peak was going great. I looked fantastic Friday night. I woke up looking pretty darn good Saturday morning, and I decided to have some muffins and a bunch of wheat products and carbohydrate sources that I haven't had in 12, 16 weeks. And things honestly just kind of did go downhill from that small, subtle, poor choice in regards to what food source I want to stick with. So yeah, you definitely want to keep fiber on the lower end of the spectrum during the carbohydrate load. But I think earlier on in the week, while you're going through that depletion phase, I think there's nothing wrong with having fiber a bit higher just to improve satiety and give yourself a little bit more food volume, especially since it's earlier on in the week, and that's not really going to negatively impact your look come, Saturday show day.
And
Right.
I did want to mention one thing that we also mentioned in the paper, and that's the sodium intake, because a lot of people actually drop sodium intake significantly while they're carbing up. And actually, if you see our protocol, we actually recommend not to do that. We actually want to keep some sodium in there, and a lot of that is for the sodium-dependent glucose transporters that are going to be responsible for shuttling that glucose and to be able to utilize it appropriately. And that may also create some GI discomfort if now you're not able to actually transport that across the intestine. So I think again, you don't necessarily need to eliminate the sodium. I think a lot of people eliminate the sodium way too early, and they're trying to carb load, and then that could create an ineffective response to the carb loading.
That's actually the next point I want to discuss, water and also sodium intake, because I think that's the most spicy topic when it comes to peak week, to cut water, to cut sodium, or to either consume lots of water, lots of sodium. There's not really a single practice, but at least here in my country, in Mexico, it's more of a common practice to just cut water altogether, cut sodium, and then you hear anecdotes of people fainting on stage, people feeling terrible, going to the emergency room. So really, I think here with in regards to water and also sodium is where things can get really dangerous for some people. Can we begin to discuss a little bit of how can we manipulate water intake and sodium, and as to why to do this?
Yeah, I think that's an important topic. And one thing that we do mention in the paper, if this is something that you can't practice, 2 to 4 weeks beforehand, it's probably something that maybe you should leave alone, because sometimes another day at the office, as we sometimes say, is just kind of show up, do what you've normally been doing, and you'll probably do fine. If you're conditioned enough and you're in great shape, it might prove to be a better thing to do. If you're trying to manipulate too many variables, you have too many balls in the air, the chances of disaster are very, very great. And with regards to water, that is actually water and sodium manipulation, because there's so much impact on your cardiovascular system. That is when you actually are playing with fire, and you are going to see these cardiovascular responses where, blood pressure drops, heart rate increases, and a lot of people can end up in the hospital or, potentially die if they're very aggressive with how they drop water. And maybe if they're adding a diuretic on top of that, it can be dangerous. So with regards to our paper, we take a conservative approach where it's still relatively safe. Obviously, we don't recommend the diuretic use. And if you are going to manipulate it, we do recommend, again, you have a practice week, at least 2 to 4 weeks beforehand, to give them some trial runs. And then if you're going to do it, you need to have a strategic plan. And there's actually a little bit of evidence that's been published, but it wasn't done in bodybuilders. It was actually done in fighters, where they actually use a water loading technique and then a water depletion technique. But even then, in the protocol, they never cut out water completely in the protocols. They're still drinking fluids throughout the entire time. They basically just go from 100 milliliters per kilogram of body weight, and then they drop it to 15 milliliters per kilogram of body weight. So there's still water being consumed throughout the process, and that can actually facilitate diuresis and facilitate the weight loss with the water loading, but without necessarily putting yourself in danger. They actually measured a couple of variables in that study, and the competitors were indeed safe. And these were not bodybuilding competitors, these were fighters. And those are some things that we want to look at. Safety first, and then, of course, there's a risk-reward ratio. So that's one of the big things that we discuss in the paper. And maybe Scott will want to elaborate on some of this here.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating topic. I think the thing that I've seen over the years so much is that the real risk comes with using the pharmaceutical diuretics. That's where things can get really out of hand. That's where people who are already dry and already in shape can just toss one of those in, shooting for that A+, and end up ruining their physique because they're already so dry just naturally from the conditioning that they've achieved with the diet, the months beforehand. I've seen with the protocol that I've used, which is very similar to what this is. It does entail usually, removing water, but we're talking, 5 o'clock at night, 6 o'clock at night. Nothing like, dropping your water on a Tuesday before a Saturday show, which I've heard of people doing.
Yeah, right.
And a very far cry from, the old school, like let's start loading aldactone in, on Monday and those sorts of things. You can get tremendously dry just by manipulating your sodium and your water intake in a way that is deceivingly simple but deceivingly powerful in doing that. And really what it comes down to is understanding that in large part, it's the sodium levels in the blood that are around which the hormones of water homeostasis are functioning. So just like you've got a basic homeostatic mechanism, like a thermostat that you have at home, and it's wanting to keep sodium levels at their natural normal levels. And by consuming sodium at a normal or maybe relative but not extraordinarily high amount, and then simply eliminating any added sodium to your diet, keeping the water intake at a relatively high level, you can end up reducing the sodium concentration in a way that the body then, in order to achieve a raised sodium concentration, will reduce body water by diuresis. And that means losing water. And the nice thing about that, the way we set it up and structured it in the paper, is that you're not trying to lose water at the same time you're trying to gain water inside the cells of the muscle. That's where I think people try to end up. It's, Guillermo's talked about, too many balls in the air. It's like trying to juggle a chainsaw when it's running and a flaming torch and a bowling ball all at once. You're doing way too much. Whereas, and those sorts of things can be done effectively, and people see that happen when you use pharmaceutical diuretics and even insulin, let's say, like that combination of drugs can achieve those sorts of contradictory effects physiologically, but it's unnecessary really, because as we mentioned before, if you've loaded the glycogen into the muscle in large part, before you try to dry out, the glycogen will still be there, having its osmotic effect, as the glycogenic complex will, holding water to whatever extent that happens for you. There's some variability there. And then the water that's lost would then primarily, this is the goal at least, and we may end up measuring these things more directly, be from that extracellular component. And the extracellular includes, of course, the interstitial water that's under the skin that would be obscuring the separation and the definition that you see. So you want to lose the extracellular and keep the intracellular. You've loaded the intracellular via the glycogen middle of the week, and then through a dehydration process where you're just manipulating sodium and water, you're able to get rid of that extracellular water, and then you've got that balance that you want of being full with intracellular water in the skeletal muscle and dry with a relative lack of extracellular water, specifically under the skin and the interstitial spaces there. So that's kind of the trick that can be had if you just do one thing followed by the next thing, and then of course fine tune the morning of the show with food, water, sodium, etc., which we go into as well. But that's kind of the main thing that I think people probably, because and I totally get this. You know, all of us here have competed multiple times. If you're trying to like figure that out in some way, shape, or form on the fly as to what you should do without a practice run by yourself, that would be just a crapshoot, especially when you're in that state of nervousness before the show and dieted down and you're running on maybe 1.5 neurons at best on a good day when you're having a moment of inspiration. So whereas if you've done a practice run and manipulated those things and seen that that can actually happen, then you've got a plan that you can simply execute, connect the dots, so to speak, because you've written it all out and you've X'd and O'd it over the course of the days before the show. And the effect can be tremendous. And I'll give another anecdote. There was long ago, this was this is 18, 19 years ago, probably almost 20 years ago. I've been playing with this for a long time. There was a competitor who asked my thoughts on this, and I gave him, this sort of an idea, and he actually was drying out so rapidly that he got scared. He wasn't using any diuretics, nothing. He just was employing the strategy we have in the paper, and he bailed ship because he saw his weight going down. He was getting really, really, really dry. But the nice thing about this is that this is being evoked by normal physiological processes. We're adding some caffeine in, perhaps, as we say in the paper, some osmotic diuretics like B vitamins, vitamin C, those sorts of things, some herbal diuretics. But we're not causing a pharmacologically induced state of dehydration, which is the dangerous ones that I think, we see, sort of made known of in the news and across the bodybuilding world. This is something that in large part is coming about just because you've manipulated the body, and it's just you basically sort of done a little white lie and a little manipulation, so to speak, to get the body to dehydrate itself, but within normal physiological limits, we could say. You could talk about what dehydration means. I think it's 2% of body weight or something like that, is maybe Guillermo knows the technical definition that's used in the literature that looks into thermal regulation during exercise. But we're not inducing, massive dehydration, like 5% of body weight. You're not taking a 170-pound competitor, and trying to take them down, by like 9 pounds below their normal body weight. By the time you've filled up with glycogen, which is going to add weight, and dehydrated, if someone wakes up the morning of a show and they're a pound or two below what their weight was before that midweek carb up, they're in great stead. They're in a really good place because they've got all that water now that's in the muscle because of the glycogen load, if it's been effective, and they've also reduced body weight by getting to that extracellular water. And if they're actually lower, that means they've accumulated a good amount of water where they want it inside the cell and gotten rid of it where they don't want it outside the cell, under the skin, in the interstitial space. So those are some thoughts on that notion.
Yeah,
Very well. Also, yeah, sure, go ahead, please.
I just want to add something really quick in regards to water. I feel like water is that one variable that probably breaks people the most, just because you can have somebody that is not in the greatest shape and they tried manipulating with water in hopes to get drier, in hopes to look leaner. But what often happens if they do it incorrectly is they are going to be unable to get a pump on stage. So even if they have a good level of muscularity, but they were just a little bit soft, they're no longer able to display that level of muscularity that they do have. And then if you have someone on the other end of the spectrum that is actually in great shape and got really, really lean and is, striated from head to toe, if they messed with their water, even if they were flat and they didn't carb up properly, if they're unable to get a pump, then they can't display their level of condition, which would be their strong point. So a lot of people want to manipulate water to highlight their strengths, but it ends up kind of giving this effect where they're no longer able to highlight what their strength actually was. So for most people, I feel like it inhibits them to get a good pump backstage, and that's the last thing you want, on show day. So if you haven't practiced this, if you haven't done a peak week trial run, it's probably the last variable I would mess with. The safest way to go about it is just take a couple refeeds, carb up, and keep water the same, and you should look just fuller without really putting much risk in regards to, am I going to be able to get a pump, so on and so forth. So it's probably the riskiest variable to play with besides, and again, that's without taking diuretics. That's just dehydrating yourself and cutting off water way too early. So that's my point too.
Also, in regards to water, I wanted to ask how fatigue and also stress and being anxious about a competition, about all the protocol, about raising cortisol, does this really have an impact in regards to water retention?
Yeah, that definitely has definitely has an impact. We actually cited a couple studies where I can't remember how much people can gain off the top of my head, but I mean, it's a significant amount, upwards of 4 to 5 kilograms of body weight in body water from that excess cortisol. And as we were talking about earlier, one variable that we have to keep important is stress management. And I think when we're getting ready for a show, if we have this extra stress, and you got to remember so many variables go into it. I mean, if you're competing nationally or internationally, not only do you have the show and all these other components, but you typically have to fly there, you have to get a hotel, you're gonna have to, bring your food. Is there a refrigerator? All of those variables come into play, and all that stress leading up to the show can be quite detrimental. And even if you've practiced it, sometimes if you didn't have the variable of that stress component, you're going to really set yourself up for failure. So I think minimizing stress, and again, the reason we actually advocate the practice week is because, as Scott already said, you kind of have a diagram already written out in terms of what's worked, how to do it, and there's really no question. You're basically just kind of following the roadmap. Of course, you can make some minor adjustments, but you have a general pathway there in front of you to figure out what you need to do, because that's going to help minimize your stress. The more you can minimize those unknowns, the lower your stress is going to be, which is going to impact your ability to sleep, your ability to just relax and recover. And again, leading up to a show, if you have everything planned, if you have all your meals there with you, hopefully you have a place with a refrigerator, you have a microwave available. That way you can stay on schedule. You can have everything available to you, rather than resorting to, are they going to have this particular food? Are they going to prepare it the same way that I prepare it, that I've been preparing it? Is it going to be the same type of food that I'm eating? All of those are going to definitely play a role.
Very well. And on to the next topic. Go ahead.
Just one thing. It's just I've seen with clients that were under a lot of pressure when we did a practice run that worked, and they duplicated everything, and the stress was just so high that the water retention, which is there's literally, it's it can be actually the deciding factor. And this is another reason why I think can't say for sure, this is armchairing. I'm an armchair psychologist. I play one on the internet and at home and, in my daily life, but I have a suspicion that bodybuilders who may be freaking out and trying last minute strategies like popping a diuretic when they maybe don't need to might also be those who would also maybe even benefit, because they're stressing out so much that a normal other protocol would not work for them. So they end up backfiring one way. They're trying to prevent a backfire that's coming about because of all the stress that they're experiencing, by using a diuretic, which, oftentimes if it's unplanned, is not going to work well either. So there's some connection between, I think, people not using non-diuretic based approaches and those who do, because if you stress out so much, a non-diuretic approach probably is not going to work for you, because it can be that powerful, at least from what I've seen. And as Guillermo said, it was maybe like 18 pounds or something like that in a matter of a day or so can be held because the cortisol binds to the mineralocorticoid receptor. There's cross receptivity there, so it literally can be a water retention, have a water retaining effect, even though it's thought of as a glucocorticoid. It can act as a mineralocorticoid, meaning it acts on sodium and sodium retention, et cetera, at the kidney. So, yeah, tremendous. The other thing I would say is sometimes if it's 6 of one and a half dozen of the other, as we say, if it's not so, you don't get a tremendous effect from doing a peak week protocol per se. You look great going into the week, but you just have something to do. Like I think Guillermo was kind of getting at, you've got a plan there. It can be worthwhile just to have a plan, just to have a pattern to follow. We're going to do this and this and this. And a lot of times that's what coaches are doing anyway, is keeping people calm and telling the things that they would know otherwise to do, but they don't have the wits about them quite enough to actually carry out without stressing about the decision-making processing part of it. And you can simply just say, we're going to do this, this, and this. It worked great. You looked great. This is what happened. And you're just following the yellow brick road, so to speak, that you've already walked down once. And that can eliminate those stressful factors that can lead to the water retention. So that's sometimes why, and people just like it. It's just kind of fun. They get to have some carbs. They get to post pictures. They get to, play with the variables. And a lot of bodybuilders are, they're experimenters at heart. They're researchers at heart. So they want to see what happens when they do these things with their body. So it gives them something fun and entertaining to do, which is really important so it's actually fun. So it's like, we know what we're going to do now. Like after we're weighing, we're going to go have our rice cakes and, jelly meal, which we know works for us, blah, blah, blah. It's a nice thing to have. So that can't be undervalued either, I think, for just maintaining where you're at with some sort of a semblance of a plan. And sometimes it's nice to have something that's different than what you've been doing for some people. It depends on the person and their psyche and, how they roll.
Right. So moving on to fat intake, if you agree, one of the things you mentioned in the paper is actually fat loading, which prior to reading the paper, I have never heard about that before. And to actually have a proposed mechanism that increases in intramuscular triglyceride, I think it was quite fascinating to view it as a mechanism to get the muscle fuller, not just think about carbs, but think actually to increase fat intake to make the muscle fuller. Can we talk a little bit of this protocol of well, not protocol, but this aspect of the peak week?
Yeah, absolutely. The thought of it really is you can actually use it hand in hand with the carb loading, because typically in the protocol that we recommend is we actually have the carb depletion early in the phase, and then we have the carb loading kind of in the middle of the week. So during that carb depletion phase, you can actually begin a little bit of the fat loading, because basically we're trying to deplete glycogen levels, but you can actually start simultaneously increasing those intramyocellular triglyceride levels by having a little bit of excess fat. This is, of course, assuming that you don't need to have a super low calorie intake. If you need to drop your calories and maybe you need to lose a little bit of extra body fat, you may not benefit from that, because you may be better off actually creating that caloric deficit. But if you're in great shape, and ideally for most shows, it's best if you're actually already in condition 2 to 4 weeks beforehand. So now you don't really need to lose more body fat. You can kind of just fine tune your physique here. So now you don't necessarily have to be so miserable when you're actually carb depleting, because you can actually have a little extra calories in the form of fat. And again, the fat is going to increase those intramyocellular triglycerides there, which there is some in there. And we actually look at what percentage of the muscle is actually this IMT, and there is a percentage there. So we actually give an example of say a 200 plus pound bodybuilder who's going to carry a large amount of muscle mass on them. So in a super compensated muscle there with the extra fat, you could actually have an extra, potentially 2 pounds of extra volume there from the intramyocellular triglycerides being full. Scott, why don't you go ahead and expand on that, because this is actually a lot of your baby here as well.
Oh yeah, it's something that actually Per Tesh, I think, did some of the original research that I recall. showing that intramuscular triglyceride can actually be used up a good bit during resistance exercise. And some of the follow-up data suggests that, well, we know just from the basic energetics that glycogen is going to be your main fuel with high-intensity exercise. Maybe during that time when you're replenishing the oxygen debt, so to speak, that the intramuscular triglyceride can get used up. So that can be a very low store going into peak week for someone who's been in a caloric deficit for a while and has been training possibly, especially if they're on a low carb diet where the carbs aren't there. They're likely to have, but this hasn't been studied directly. So this is one of those sections we're hoping will maybe launch some at least sort of master's theses initially. That's the way sometimes these new areas sort of first get explored, and then someone latches on to see, that it's really valuable. So there's intramuscular triglyceride does take up, as Guillermo said, a percentage volume of the muscle. So there's a loading effect to be had there. It's not as large as glycogen, but there's something to be had there. But sort of the more interesting thing for me especially has been that, one, you can use it during exercise, but also that you can actually lower intramuscular triglyceride levels. There's an interaction between glycogen loading and IMT. So that having IMT around is important for glycogen levels to be elevated. And if you want to have, and this sort of explains to some degree the shitload effect, whereby there's some energy that goes into the loading per se. If you actually look at the bioenergetics of the ATP required to form glycogen during glycogen synthesis, there's some energy requirements there. And especially in a damaged state, you can run into issues here. But having fats around may help with better glycogen loading, because those fats will be used as in some way that is not understood as far as I know, at least specifically in terms of like what's going on in a sort of an energetic dynamics between the use of fats as a fuel while in a storage mode of storing glycogen in the cells. But you want to have fats around in order to store glycogen. So sort of setting up the cell with fats, with the fat loading early in the week before you do glycogen loading can be helpful there. Also, if you're loaded with glycogen and you want to make sure you want to hold that glycogen load, so to speak, so the middle of the week, Wednesday and Thursday, you're filled with glycogen, the muscles are now full, you'd want to then keep fats as your main fuel so that you're not actually in a caloric deficit because you're eating too little. So you have a chance to fat load there, which really has, at least empirically, almost no chance of causing a spilling phenomenon that I'm aware of. Some of that's because fats in general, there's going to many reasons for this potentially, but if you're taking a fatty diet, even if there's protein there, you're going to have lower insulin levels. That spilling phenomenon that comes with glycogen and glucose, my best guess is because the glycogen levels become full, and now the movement of glucose from the inside the bloodstream across the cells into the muscle cells means that there's sort of a backlog. The glucose is no longer being deposited as glycogen. Instead, it's making its way out of the intravascular space to the extravascular space, which is the interstitial space between the muscle cell and the vasculature. And when it gets caught in there, it has an osmotic effect and brings water to it. So that's that spilling phenomenon that happens. Sodium is probably also involved there. This isn't something that's going to happen, to my knowledge at least, with eating fats, just fats per se. So you could have a fat loading that goes on the day before a show and still be drying out and not have that spilling or water retention going on. So you're getting extra muscle volumization happening the day before a show, and maybe even filling up those fat stores, because if you glycogen loaded with really high carb intake, let's say you're someone like me and the only way you can get down 1,500 or 2,000 grams of carbs in 2 days is to eat really low fat foods that are absorbed really rapidly. The data suggests that you would lower your intramuscular triglyceride levels in doing that. So now you have a chance to refill those. So maybe you've filled them up early in the week when you're getting ready and prepping for your glycogen load. They've come down a little bit during the glycogen, and now you can refill them a bit the day before with a secondary fat load, sort of the next day, or the day before the show, the day after your carbohydrate loading. So there's some dynamics between the energy storage that are really, as far as I can tell, really kind of poorly understood and understudied, especially in this context with bodybuilders. There's not a whole lot of money and reason for doing this. You know, Gatorade's not going to pay for this sort of thing because bodybuilders aren't their target demographic for selling products. So, but I really think there's something there, and you know, this is something that coaches have been using. Actually, it's been around for a long time. I mean, 30 years for sure, and probably way before that. I just wasn't aware of it. You know, we rarely do we come up, you know, and actually we're just reinventing the wheel for the most part. So this something that would apply to, especially depending on what the person's diet was like as they came into the show. So I mentioned you're going to be depleted generally, and Chris said this too. But if you're someone who's, for instance, been using sort of a low-fat, higher-carb approach as you come into the show, and you probably got really good experience with how manipulating carb intake will fill you up or not fill you up, that's already sort of a checklist. You know you need to do that. But that person may very well be low in intramuscular triglyceride stores. So that's someone who might benefit from a fat load and really focusing on fats earlier in the week, on basically bookmarking on either side of that glycogen supercompensatory period in the middle of the week. So it's a strategy that, you know, is going to be, as opposed to everything we talked about, person-specific, diet-specific, context-specific. So yeah, it is a fascinating one. And the thing that I really am interested to kind of know is that we know that, this is sort of basic information, a lot of it comes from the diabetes literature, is that the larger the intramuscular triglyceride stores, the greater their propensity for someone to have insulin resistance. So you tend to see lots of fat droplets inside the muscle cells in those individuals who have insulin resistance or overtly just diabetic because of that. But we know fats have differential effects on insulin sensitivity. So, you know, what would happen, for instance, if we were to compare, you know, groups of people or just the same individual in terms of glycogen storage, if the fats were primarily saturated fats, or if we included a large percentage polyunsaturated fatty acid-based triglycerides. So someone ate just, you know, beef tallow, and fish, salmon, steelhead trout, mackerel, etc. Those fishes with Arctic fishes, cold water fishes with lots of PUFAs in them, polyunsaturated fatty acids. What would happen in terms of storage of those fatty acids? That's the other thing that's, you know, different from carbohydrate. We're thinking you've got a branching enzyme and things that are involved with that glycogen-glycogenin complex that happens. That's fairly well known, been fairly well studied, the you know, the carbon connections that are there. But how does fat loading differ depending on the fat source, the fatty acid source that you have? You know, what's best for actually bringing about that effect, and does it even matter? And do the types of fats that you're taking in have an impact there? One thing we know that, you know, seems to make a difference with the polyunsaturated fatty acids, because of their shape, those will end up incorporating themselves into the cell membrane in a way that gives more cell membrane fluidity. So it just helps to sort of ease the interaction when basically any extracellular ligand is binding to its receptor on the cell's plasma membrane. So it's just a good thing to have good plasma cell membrane. So sort of flexibility in the system gives you some degrees of freedom for ligands, hormones, cytokines, et cetera, that are going to bind the cell and have their actions. If you take someone who's been eating like a low-carb diet with mainly saturated fats versus one that's got more quote-unquote healthy fats, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated, are they setting themselves up for even a better carb load, or because these are foods they've been eating, for better fat loading and increasing the enzymes that are involved for storing intramuscular triglycerides of that nature because it's been in their diet? Are they priming themselves for a better fat loading effect, and a better fat loading effect that improves or enhances insulin sensitivity? So the carb loading effect's even better as well. So there's some interaction potential between the carbs long-term, chronically in the diet, what that does to membrane sensitivity, as well as the storage of those fatty acids based on their structure, and then what both of those things do as far as the storage of glycogen as it proceeds throughout the week and is maintained throughout the week. So just like, I mean, I'm wishing I was a master's degree student right now so I could go do some of these studies, because it sounds like, you know, it's really kind of pretty cool stuff, at least in my mind. And, you know, I'm thinking of it from a bodybuilder's perspective. There's obviously health ramifications here too, in terms of glucose control and diabetes, which is obviously a big issue in the States especially. So those are some thoughts on fats.
Yeah, quick thing I just wanted to say from a practical sense, super fast. A lot of people that do a depletion phase, I see a lot of people in the space kind of do like a protein sparing modified fast where their fat intake's low and their carb intake's low when they're going through depletion. So they're eating really lean meats like chicken or whitefish, and then they're just doing vegetables to kind of run through their stored glycogen. That's not what we're suggesting, and that's not what we're doing. So kind of when we implement the carbohydrate depletion, you don't have to be in this massive caloric deficit like you see with a lot of people doing like PSMF in the beginning of the week. I'm selecting fat protein sources that are higher in fat, so it can be something like a grass-fed beef or a lot of wild salmon or a lot of whole eggs, whatever it may be. But the fat intake is, relatively high, and a lot of it's coming from those protein sources as well. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Also, in regards, if you have the time, of course, can we mention a little bit? I'm sorry, Dr. Stevenson?
Oh, just one thing too, it kind of relates to what Chris is saying, is that we tend to, as bodybuilders, the harder the better, right? The more difficult, the greater the reward. We want to delay the gratification, so we have this tremendous victory at the end in terms of the dopamine that just floods our brains when everything happens the way we want it to. And so you don't have to go super strict, and eat nothing but, tilapia and green beans or what have you during that period. But also, if you look at some of the original literature, and this makes sense to have done this, and this was a long time sort of the standard strategy in the endurance world, I'm not that well connected there, was that glycogen needed to be like completely depleted, like down to zilch, like no carbs. And I played around with so many different protocols back in the day to see if it made a difference, that you would get a greater super compensatory effect by going all out in your training and doing a whole bunch of extra volume so you can get the glycogen levels really low, so you get this super compensation, this sort of spring back to get the highest level possible when you finally start to load in the middle of the week in our protocol. And you don't really need to do that. There's a guy named Bill Sherman who did some work. It's like, it's in the 80s now, I believe, where, you could do much more moderate approach. This is all outlined in the paper, and still achieve, at least with endurance exercise, the same level of super compensation. So you don't have to go rock bottom in order to get back up to a high level. You can simply, adjust your diet the way we've set out in the paper and still achieve what you want. And another advantage to that, very likely, especially if someone's going to want to try to do something different in their training to achieve really low glycogen levels, is that's probably going to bring about a muscle damaging effect, because it's going to be more volume they're used to, or they're just trying to just kill themselves, perhaps even for psychological reasons. They're not going to deserve those carbs, right, Guillermo? You don't get those carbs unless you killed yourself beforehand, right? He's like, that's really, I've had the same, you got to earn your food, right? Like we're Pavlovian beasts, must earn the bell so we get to eat. And in doing so, the muscle damage can literally prevent. There's actually one study, it's a pretty diabolical effect. I think it was Zehner, Zehner was the first author, where they literally found no replenishment of glycogen in 24 hours, despite like 1,000 grams a day in a highly damaged muscle. And so you can create energy demands so that you don't replenish glycogen at all if you overdo it during those days. So that's another issue that could be, everything else could be lined up really, really well. The carb intake is fine. What you did dietarily was fine. But if you just do something that just destroys you in the gym because you're thinking, well, gosh, normally I train 5 days a week, and now I'm going to stop training on Wednesday, and I'm not going to train Thursday or Friday until the show. Like, I don't take 2 days off ever. So you're thinking you need to cram together, not only make up for that, but do extra because you're wanting to get the glycogen super compensation. And now you may shoot your entire glycogen loading protocol totally in the foot, especially if you're limiting your glycogen, your carbohydrate intake. So extremism is not the goal, so to speak, of the week. It's smart manipulation, if that's a smart thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that's the hardest thing for us bodybuilders to get through our head, is that sometimes harder and extreme is not always the best, and that's hard for a lot of us to swallow, because we always think we want to take everything to the highest level. More is better, harder is better, and that actually isn't always the case. Particularly when it comes to this, it's not always that the extreme doesn't always work to give you the best reward. Oftentimes.
Expanding a little bit on that topic, if you have the time, if you all have the time, about training, how can we manipulate our training? Because that's exactly the mentality, to go all in, to give it all, to do all the cardio in the world, to do all the resistance training in the world. But some things you highlight in your paper, it's to reduce the eccentric component, because precisely of the muscle damage, and to actually taper cardio, which is the opposite of what most people do, at least here where I am.
Yeah, Chris, you wanna touch on this a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. Yeah, so during peak week, again, during the depletion phase, I might have athletes or a client, I might recommend them go in and do, honestly, a lot of times it's like circuit style training where they might just pair an agonistic and antagonistic movements just for time efficiency purposes. And we're keeping loads, honestly, a little bit lighter than their actual working sets or training loads throughout their prep. And their rate of perceived exertion or their total level of effort is actually going to be a little bit lower. So during this time, I want to focus on lifts that are more concentric focused. I don't want to do something that is really an eccentric focused lift that can create a lot of muscle damage. So an example of that would be like a Romanian deadlift, where it's very eccentric dominant and you're overloading the hamstrings in their lengthened position. So that can create a lot of muscle damage in the hamstrings, and that can potentially inhibit your body's ability to store glycogen in that muscle. So again, I'm going to avoid things like dumbbell flies or dumbbell lat pullovers, anything that's really overloading that lengthened position that can create more damage. And I'm typically doing higher rep work. It can be anywhere from 12 to 20 reps. And during the depletion phase, knowing that the carbohydrate intake is going to be low, I don't need to do a ton of volume. You do want to deplete that gas tank of each and every working muscle group, but you don't need to do an insane amount of volume, because your body's going to burn through that stored energy because your calories or your carbohydrate intake is so low anyway. So I would say volume is kind of moderate, a little bit lower than their normal training volume, and then their repetition ranges are slightly higher. And then me personally, a lot of times the last day of training might be on Thursday, which is like their final carbohydrate load day. Again, they might do a really light circuit just to see if they get an amazing pump, just to give the athlete a slightly better idea of how they're looking super full and pumped up. And then Friday, they're totally resting. I see a lot of athletes overpose or overtrain on Friday, the day before the show. And that is part of the reason why they may be flat on Saturdays, because they ended up burning through too much of that glycogen rather than keeping it stored. So the training is definitely lower in intensity, typically higher repetition work. It's not necessary, though. You are going to deplete glycogen even utilizing more moderate rep ranges, but that's generally what I employ. What about you, Dr. Guillermo and Dr. Scott?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Chris. I mean, a few things in addition to what Chris said is, you don't want to try new exercises, novel exercises. You want to stick things that work for you. And this can be challenging because sometimes you travel to another gym and you may have new equipment that you have to deal with. So, they might have that cool machine, maybe that pendulum squat machine that you wanted to try and you don't have it at your gym. And that's probably not the best time to go try that pendulum squat machine and have a killer workout there where you're going to, be excessively sore. So the main thing is you want to avoid muscle soreness. So that's why I think, again, rate of perceived exertion, your workout should definitely be a few notches below normal. You need to do decent volume, but not excessive volume. I think when you're carb depleting, because you are carb depleting, again, you do want to deplete the glycogen out of those muscles early. But if you're carb depleting, say on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, I think that's kind of when most of these type of workouts need to be in there. I think once you get closer to Wednesday, Thursday, there's kind of two trains of thought. You can train those days, but those days should definitely be a lot lighter, because the goal of that point in time, if you're carb loading on Wednesday, Thursday, is to actually glycogen load. And if you're depleting your body too much and you have too much going on in your workout, you're going to now, instead of needing to take 800 grams of carbs, you now need to take maybe 1,500 grams of carbs, excuse me, which can make it more difficult. So if you're going to train on those carb loading days, you can. But as Chris stated is, definitely keep your body maybe a little bit lower, your intensity a little bit lower. Make sure that you're compensating for the energy that you utilize during those workouts. And I think definitely Friday, key to definitely rest, not overly pose. So you want to pose a little bit, but not to the point where you're totally fatiguing yourself at that point in time. So that, again, as we stated earlier, because all of these variables go hand in hand. So the glycogen is going to help store that intracellular water. So if we start depleting a lot of that, then we're actually losing a lot of that potentially that intracellular water, which is going to help with the muscle fullness. So doing cardio, on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday before the show is definitely not ideal. I think you should definitely cut it out by then. To me, I think cardio probably by Tuesday, maybe Wednesday would be the last day you'd want to do it. Definitely when you're carb loading, you want to eliminate that component of it.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I've had a couple thoughts that I don't think either of these things. Well, I know one of them's not covered in the paper. There's a really nice gym in Orlando where they've been having a lot of shows here with COVID, and it's called Kissimmee Muscle. It was well attended the last Olympia, I know, and they've had Masters Nationals down there, and the North Americans was there, and I was in there training. I think after a show I competed in, talking to the owner, and he talked about a woman who was a women's physique competitor competing on a Saturday, I think, or 2 days before that, and she came into the gym and she just loved the machines. They were great. She was an animal, like a lot of high-level women competitors, just like incredible recovery. She can basically do whatever she wants. And he noticed she'd be in there for like 2.5 hours, and she's just going to town on this equipment because she likes it so much. And he walked over and confirmed that she had said that she's competing in 2 days, and she's like, yeah. She's like, I really love your equipment. It's so great. He's like, how many sets have you done? She's like, it's like 50, I think, just for legs. So yeah, you can't overdo that. I think she did well. She was, such a good competitor. It didn't matter much. So yeah, all those things were great points. So there's multiple ways to sort of skin the cat. There's one thing that is not mentioned in the paper. I'm pretty sure it's something I have that I sort of worked out with John Meadows. Actually, two of us employed this with clients and ourselves a few years back, and I put it in my book where I have a chapter on this whole idea, and people have told me they've used it. I've used it a few times with clients too. I call it an advanced loading protocol. So it's for that scenario, which we tried to cover as well, where someone needs to make weight. And in doing so, they're having to basically do no carb up during the week before the weigh-ins, because that's going to increase their body weight and they won't make their weight class. So we have a whole scenario we outline there. And one of the things that I've employed, which is kind of fun, and it's going to sound like I'm trying to sell my book because it's kind of written out in there, but it's really simple strategy is someone would basically do everything to keep their body weight as low as possible. So literally the water manipulation potentially, if they needed to be dry and a low body weight before weighing in. And then thereafter, and this is a strategy that's going to be dependent upon the timing of the weigh-ins relative to the show and the person, of course, someone would go and very carefully go to the gym and employ a workout where they're loading in carbs and water and sort of titrating those things in as their look moves along, and try to do a last-minute carb up in that way, which we do outline in the paper. So that's adding in some training there. Again, nothing overboard, nothing with any of those lengthened, eccentric, accentuated exercises. Choose your exercises smart, but you can use that because there's an insulin-like effect of muscle contraction. So it's something where someone could use that to, it seems like at least, and this again hasn't been documented that I know in this particular context, glycogen load using exercise to facilitate that when you're in a last-minute situation and you really want to get a nice filling effect from some exercise itself, because you really got limited time. You can only glycogen load so fast. And that's something that seems to help it out. And it's also I'll tell you what, I've done that not because I needed to make weight. I just did it to practice for multiple shows and in practice runs too. And it's kind of fun, to be honest. It was nice to go and weigh in and then just go to the gym. You're dried out, you look phenomenal, and you're actually working out at the same time and taking in the car. So you feel really good, you look really good, you're watching yourself volumize. It was really kind of like, it would be bodybuilders Valhalla, basically, to go and train like that, because you're filling out and dry and everything's coming together all at once. So, and it's great because it gives you something to do. A lot of people, they weigh in and they're like, okay, what do I do now? Well, if you can go train, you get the exercise in, it gives you something to do, and there's an anxiolytic effect from exercise. That's why many of us do this as therapy. So it gives you a last therapy treatment before you get on stage, and it makes you feel like you've done something, which I think is a reason why a lot of bodybuilders will want to train like right through the week. Doesn't make sense, as we said, from a glycogen storage standpoint, to be using up glycogen when you're trying to keep it there or load it in. But this is a scenario where you've had to run up against no glycogen loading, and you're trying to employ strategies and a little bit of smart exercise muscle physiology to use the workout itself to elicit a faster loading effect. And it seems to work from the times that John and I did it with ourselves and with clients, and it's fun as well. So ultimately, unless you're making money, this is all about, a hobby that hopefully should be fun. So that's one thing that in that situation makes sense, and it seems like it works.
And to briefly finish this off, if you have all the time, because I want to be super respectful of your time, we cover a lot of topics. Just the one missing, it's supplements. Can we just finish off talking about a little bit supplements, especially creatine monohydrate and vitamin C, which it's widely used in the pig week.
Yeah, I'm going to let the gentleman. I have another meeting I have to get to, so I'll let Chris and Scott. Hopefully, they have a little bit of time. But thank you for inviting me. It was great to have you, and it's great to see you, Chris and Scott. Always love to chat with you guys. But have a great one. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Guillermo.
Enjoy, Guillermo.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thanks, Doc.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
Chris, you want to get that one?
So,
I think you did the supplement section mainly.
Yeah, I'll start this off, man. So in regards to supplements, I know you specifically asked about creatine and vitamin C. Creatine is one of those supplements that we recommend, honestly. Obviously the paper was just on peak week, but I would say the three of us would encourage all physique competitor athletes to keep that in their entire contest prep, just to maximize muscle cell fullness and volume, as well as obviously performance and strength, power output and everything like that. So there is some pretty solid literature showing that maximizing your phosphocreatine stores is going to have more water and fullness within the muscle, and from a volume standpoint, that's going to improve the physique's look. So that's something we keep in the entire peak week. A lot of people also kind of fear creatine monohydrate, and they opt for creatine hydrate chloride. We don't believe that that's really necessary, unless there's a specific individual response where monohydrate is causing a lot of GI distress or some bloating. Then you can potentially explore utilizing creatine hydrochloride instead. But generally speaking, creatine is something that we keep in the entire prep. And throughout peak week, it's something that we do not pull or that we don't really manipulate at all. And then we also mentioned some herbal diuretics in there as well.
Sure.
So things like dandelion root can potentially be employed depending on what you're doing with your water and what kind of approach you're trying to take. Again, if that's something you haven't experimented with, I wouldn't throw it in last minute. The effects of dandelion root on excreting additional water does seem to be pretty acute. It seems to kind of have this 12 to 24 hour effect. So it's not something you want to take for multiple days on end before leading up to the show, but probably something you would employ just the day before the show. However, I would say I have seen implementing this with certain athletes or certain clients. It almost seems like it leads to too much water excretion, and the athlete actually looks a little bit flatter. So it's something you definitely want to experiment with on an individual basis before just kind of throwing the entire kitchen sink at your peak week and trying to do everything at once without experimentation beforehand. So anything else you would say, Dr. Scott, on creatine or something like dandelion root?
Not those two specifically. You cover those pretty well. It's there's one thing I didn't mention. I was going to mention, I think, before when it came to fiber, and this is just another. It's not in the paper, but one thing that I've been throwing at people for a while that seems to work is Benefiber. Is a soluble fiber. It's Walmart and pretty much any drugstore. And there you guys, I lost you for a second. And that's something that could be added in for instance, the end of a carb up, it's completely soluble, tasteless. You can just throw it in water. And even you could have it when you're drinking water the day of the show after you've reduced your carbs, as just to have some fiber in there, because constipation can be an issue for some people when they get really, really dry. It's not a very helpful thing. Another thing that I think would be interesting to hear more feedback on and hear from people, because some people get a really nice sort of, at least psychologically, they get an ergogenic effect from keto monoesters or ketones of some form. The salts aren't the best option, but the monoesters is something you could use when training on a low-carb diet early on. Caffeine, of course, like literally each step of the way, there are supplements that you could use to sort of help, you know, with psychologically and or for the physiological effect you're trying to evoke. So creatine's going to help with glycogen loading. Actually, carbohydrates help with creatine loading. So those are both from. Caffeine is something that's, you know, you can be used supplementally for drying out. Sleep aids are important, you know, for instance, just so people can get to sleep. Sleeping the night before a show can make or break you. So that's a stress-related phenomenon. Those keto monoesters could potentially be helpful. So, you know, when you're talking about loading glycogen or enhancing performance or drying out or being calm, cool, and relaxed during your peak week, there's supplements that can help with all of those things. So bodybuilders love supplements, tinker with things. So there's a lot that can be employed, but it's so variable as to how well they work for different people. So hopefully you guys can hear me okay. You're both just spinning circles right now. I'm not seeing much there.
Yeah, there you go.
Back now, I think.
Yeah,
all good.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good.
Yep. Yeah,
Okay,
that kind of brings some.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, Scott got cut off now.
Yeah,
But that
no,
brings
don't worry. We'll see.
that brings another supplement to my mind too, and that's actually glycerol. It's not covered in the paper,
Right.
but glycerol is a supplement that I do like using backstage for like a little pre-pump up action. It does draw a lot of fluid within inside the cell, so it can definitely help with fullness and volume and help the athlete get a really good pump beforehand. So that's another supplement that I do use, but it's not something that we went over in the paper specifically.
There you go. We just lost Scott, but don't worry.
Yeah.
I just invited him just to. Well, anyway, there you go. There you go. He's back. But anyway, I just wanted to thank you. I think that covers it. I don't want to take any more of your time. I know how busy you are. So anyway, thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks a lot, Dr. Stevenson. It's been a huge pleasure, a huge honor. I'll be posting a little bit of a post in Spanish about all the things we talked. I'll be sure to tag you. And then again, thanks a lot. I really had a great time, learned a lot, and it's been a huge pleasure.
My pleasure, man. Thank you for having us on. I really appreciate it,
my
Daniel.
pleasure as well.
So anyway, have a great day, and I hope to see you soon.
Take care, Scott. I'll see you soon, brother.
All right. Thanks, Daniel.